All right, so President Joseph Robinette Biden just unveiled his fiscal year 2023 budget proposal, and it's somehow even worse than what my very low expectations of Joe Biden would have expected. So this is honestly indistinguishable from something you could have expected from a Republican president, but let's just go ahead and get into some of the details. So here from Vox, they say what Biden is really saying in his new budget. So first off, this budget that he's putting forward as the president is mostly just messaging. It's mostly just like him virtue signaling as to what his priorities are right now, and trying to set up that framework that then Congress would then go and nominally use, I guess, to then put forward the final budget. So let's go ahead and hear about what Joe Biden thinks is his, top priorities of today. So they say President Joe Biden released his yearly budget on Monday, and it focuses on two subjects that voters have been especially concerned about: crime and inflation. Okay, so they say the budget, which lays out how much spending Biden is requesting for different federal agencies, is effectively a messaging tool for Democrats to showcase where they stand on key issues ahead of what's expected to be a challenging midterm election cycle. And they say major sections of the $5.8 trillion plan are aimed at countering attacks Republicans have levied that frame Democrats as soft on crime and responsible for soaring household costs. So listen, basically what they're saying here is that Democrats are just taking whatever random, nonsense right-wing attacks that are coming from the Republican Party and are basically just completely giving into that and feeding into their narratives and basically trying to be like, no, we're actually much more like Republicans and we aren't these scary radical socialists that they're calling us. We're going to be even further to the right on economics and militarism and policing, etc. So again, even just the notion that you would make these your two top priorities, crime and inflation. Yeah, inflation is going to be a massive issue, but you could still tackle that issue from a left-wing perspective. Same with crime, but mostly on inflation. What you're going to see here is they're basically leaning into like the austerity mindset more than they're leaning into actually tackling some of the main problems and causes of inflation, like corporate greed or the profiteering of companies that we've seen in especially like the oil markets recently, but all across the American economy, as well as building up our domestic supply chain and domestic manufacturing here. It doesn't really go and lean into that left-wing economic vision. It leans much more into like the austerity vision, or effectively that's what it's going to turn out to be at the end of the day. So these are just, completely, leaning into whatever the Republican attacks have been, but they continue saying Republicans have already begun to criticize the budget. Okay, already criticizing the budget, even though it's leaning into their own attacks, okay? Giving into everything that they have been criticizing Biden for, being this radical leftist that he never was in the first place. But Republicans have already begun to criticize the budget because it doesn't matter how far right Democrats move. They will always be called radical socialists. And they say, which they argue doesn't do enough to bolster national security spending. Okay, Republicans are saying Biden's proposal, which jacks up the military budget, and you're going to see the details of all of this in a second here, jacks up the military budget, jacks up funding to the police, jacks up funding to ICE and border patrols. That's just not enough for them. Okay, so they continue saying a sign that the final spending bills will likely be quite different, so even more to the right than what Biden is proposing. But they say President Biden's fiscal year 2023 budget has proven to be once again wholly inadequate, said Representative Mike Rogers from Alabama, the top Republican on the House Armed Services Committee, said in a Monday statement. So the record military budgets that he is proposing are still not enough for the Republicans. So they say, what's in the budget? So the $5.8 trillion plan, which includes $1.6 trillion in discretionary spending, contains significant new tax proposals, as well as increases in military funding as Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues. And they say its requests are ultimately an increase over the discretionary spending that Congress approved for 2022 and feature about $813 billion for defense-related programs. I talked about this in my video the other day, and $769 billion for domestic social programs. So already, even just at face value, the social programs that we are implementing are totally inadequate. But $813 billion compared to $769 billion for domestic social programs. So already you see what his priorities are here very clearly. But they say here are some of the key provisions. So a new minimum income tax for billionaires. The budget sets up a notable new 20% minimum income tax for households that are worth more than $100 million. And this new proposal could help raise as much as $360 billion over 10 years, half of which would come from billionaires. And this provision, however, is likely to face pushback from Republicans and conservative Democrats who have been reluctant to increase taxes on wealthy individuals. So this is great in theory. I don't think it goes nearly far enough, but in theory, theory, this would be great. Now, they're already admitting this isn't going to be as a part of this bill, okay? This isn't going to be a part of the final budget. This is just Joe Biden essentially doing some virtue signaling here, but they continue saying a new corporate tax rate. The corporate tax rate would be increased to 28%, okay? So even in Biden's wildest dreams, still not even going back to the tax rate that it was under Obama, but they say up from the current 21% level that was set by Republican tax cuts in 2017 under Trump. And they say similarly, this proposal has seen Republican opposition in the past. So again, neither of these two things, which are basically the only two actual like real positive things that were included in this budget, are not going to be included in the final budget. So now we get to some of the negative things. They say major increase in defense spending. Biden is requesting $813 billion for defense. It's our war budget, our imperialism budget, $31 billion more than what Congress had approved for 2022, and up 4% overall. And it's intended to cover the costs of additional aid to Ukraine, investments in the U.S. military's technology, and efforts to address threats from North Korea and Iran. Okay, just completely bullshit threats that are non-existent. North Korea is not a threat to the United States, okay? This is not a justification for increasing our already absurdly bloated military budget that they can't even, the Pentagon can't even pass an audit to tell us where this money is fucking going in the first place. So it's kind of a contradiction, a direct contradiction, to say that you are prioritizing caring about fiscal responsibility, but oh, by the way, we're also going to throw the largest sum of money within this budget at the Pentagon, which is a complete fiscal black hole, okay? It's just a direct, ridiculous contradiction from what they're saying up here on the fiscal responsibility side of it. But they say a boost to law enforcement spending. There's $32 billion in the budget to increase state and local police staffing for programs like community policing, violence interventions, and gun trafficking. And finally, they say a fund for parts of Build Back Better. And this is just completely, there are no specific line items or any actual specific policies in this. So this is just a general conceptual thing, I guess. Build Back Better is dead. We've heard this from Joe Manchin about 50 times so far. So listen, all of the major parts of this that would be positive, right? The tax increases on corporations, the tax increases on billionaires, the funding of parts of Build Back Better, all of those positive things aren't even going to be a part of the end result of what the final budget is going to be looking like, okay? Because Republicans are not going to approve this shit. Conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have already rejected these types of policy proposals. So really, the budget that Biden is putting forward here is really just a giant, slush fund for the military and for police. That's really what this is. That's what the majority of this budget seems to be. So just completely absurd. And again, leaning into the arguments and the attacks that we have seen from Republicans in ways that aren't even going to make political sense. But just as a reminder here, you don't have to take my word that this is like a reflection of Joe Biden's values, because he's openly advertising this. He says, budgets are statements of values. The budget I am releasing today sends a clear message. We value fiscal responsibility. Again, no, you don't, because if you did, you would be cutting the military budget. But they also value apparently safety and security at home and around the world, and the investments needed to continue building a better America. So really, all he's saying here is we value austerity, meaning fiscal responsibility, austerity, and safety and security, meaning endless militarism and imperialism. So listen, this budget is absolute dog shit, okay, from just so many different perspectives, both on the substance of it, because you're tossing more money at the Pentagon, tossing more money at our already inflated military budget that doesn't need this excess money. If anything, we should be reducing the amount that we are flooding into the military and the Pentagon and the State Department, etc. But on top of the substance of all of this, and also with the policing issue, it's like this is just feeding into these right-wing narratives, right? No major police hubs around the United States ever got defunded. This was just a slogan that came out of an activist movement that was pushing back against the over-policing that exists already within the United States. So we had the largest civil rights movement in U.S. history, okay, in the wake of the Breonna Taylor and George Floyd murders, and we had the largest civil rights movement in U.S. history, and the response to that was essentially the worst virtue signaling you could have ever imagined, with liberals going out and, changing a couple street signs and painting that street out near Washington, D.C. with Black Lives Matter, and, Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer getting on their knees in kente cloth and, taking a knee for George Floyd. You had all of these virtue signaling responses, and you never had any of the substantive demands from Black Lives Matter or from any of the activists that were on the ground. None of those demands were ever met in a substantive way, and then you still just had this massive conservative reactionary backlash to that movement, to where now we're seeing record increases to our police budgets, to ICE, to Customs and Border Protection, and to the military. It's like this is 100% just just feeding into the attacks that Republicans have been waging against Democrats. All of those attacks have been completely fabricated. They've been on false premises, right? The false premise that our military is somehow like weak, or that it's underfunded and ill-equipped to handle the threats posed by China and Russia. It's like none of that is true. None of the narratives that they've been pushing surrounding defunding the police and the spike in crime, none of that has been true. It's been entirely based on false premises. And what is Joe Biden? What did the Democratic Party? What do they do in response to those bullshit narratives? They don't counter them. They don't make the actual arguments against those bullshit premises that are being set up by Republicans. They don't do any of that. They basically just accept their premises and then lean into that same messaging as if that's going to work against Republicans. I mean, we already saw the response. Republicans are already pushing back against this budget from the right. They're still going to call him a radical leftist. They're still going to say that he is exactly like Bernie Sanders or Karl Marx, because there is no fucking difference to these people. They will keep dragging us to the right as far as they are allowed to go. So the actual strategy that would be effective in this situation is to cut out the bullshit, stop the culture war, fights that are going on with Republicans right now, and focus in on a very simple economic message. That's what you should be doing right now. Don't be focusing on inflating our military budget or shoveling out more money to the police because their feelings got hurt because we had a civil rights movement against their brutality. Don't feed into those narratives, but turn around and actually just lay out your economic policy framework. Do try to push aggressively for the taxes on billionaires to pay for social programs like the expansion of the child tax credit that apparently cut child poverty in half, that they just let completely end out of existence, and now we had a massive spike in child poverty. Do any of even the half-assed neoliberal reforms that Joe Biden himself was putting forward within Build Back Better. Focus on those things and make the positive case for that economic platform, but he's not doing that, and so Democrats are still going to be on track to get absolutely shellacked in the midterms because they're essentially just trying to pretend to be Republicans, and they're not going to be able to successfully outflank them from the right on any of these issues, and they're also going to get clobbered on the culture war issues because they're not even effectively winning those debates at all. So really, this is just a perfect example of the pathetic nature of the current state of the Democratic Party right now. Joe Biden putting his agenda out there, essentially just Ronald Reaganism, 7.0.